you might form an impression. And Mike is probably one of the most well-balanced and externally open people I've ever come across. So he is just a sponge with information. He is just so well thought out in his approach. And ESG is one of those topics that I think really requires a well-balanced and well-measured approach, because taken to an extreme one way or the other, things could really turn out, not what you would hoped. But Mike is the president of CertainPoint Strategies, which is his own firm, and he's also heavily involved with the American Council for Capital Formation. That sounds a little scary, but is a very important group around the topic of how capital gets allocated. And ESG is a major force in how capital is being allocated, and it is just growing and growing. So Mike, I'm going to turn it over to you. I know you have a presentation for us, and happy to take questions at the end. I really encourage questions, and I think when you go through this, every time that Gigi and I have talked to Mike, we end up at an hour and a half or more, and we still have more questions. So very, very timely topic. And Mike, with that, I will turn it over to you. And thank you for joining us tonight.
Lowell, can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Okay, Lowell, thank you, and Gigi as well. I want to say, first of all, good afternoon, and how very much I appreciate this opportunity to address the Montgomery County Chamber of Commerce. This subject, just as Gigi indicated a moment ago, is front and center. It is one of the most important issues that companies are dealing with in this day and age. And while I wish we could be here in person doing this, I think we've all gotten used to these virtual presentations over the last 2 years. And at this point, staying healthy and safe is probably the most important thing we can do. So I'm going to work my way through the presentation for about the next 30 minutes or so. Q&A and discussion are extremely important when we're done. There's a lot to be learned. As you're going to hear in this presentation, we're at the initial stages with ESG. A lot of people have a lot to learn. And as we say, there's a lot of perspectives. And as you're going to learn, there are a lot of challenges, not only in the changing world, but absolutely within the organizations that have to use ESG. What I'm going to assume at this stage of the game is that I've got people who understand it well, if they're publicly held companies, and there may be some suppliers and privately held organizations as well, that will find they are part of this new world of ESG as much as anyone else. So we'll take it from there, and I'll take a moment to kind of walk through. I'm trying to move my slide here. Whoever is running this, let's see. Here we go. There we go. Thank you. So what are we going to talk about for the next 30 minutes or so, followed by Q&A and discussion? Why it's important to every business. Importantly, how did we get there? Why did we evolve from where we were almost 50 years ago, as you'll see, to where we are today? There's a wave of change and new investors out there, and there's a market response, and there's an action and strategy being put into place. As a result of that, those new investors are responding. And ESG rating agencies, scores, and frameworks become more and more important. Gigi alluded to that just a moment ago. Your perception as an organization can be reduced to a rating. And we'll talk about how that occurs and why it's so important that you stay engaged in it. I'm going to touch on US regulation very, very briefly. I have been watching closely to see if anything comes out of the SEC, and so far nothing, but it's coming. We'll talk about some of the challenges and opportunities, what we think is important to watch, and we'll talk about some action plans that I think are something that you ought to give some consideration to. And then, of course, as we said, follow this up with Q's and A's. Okay, there we go. So the first thing I think everybody needs to understand, I think everybody understands the ESG, the environmental, the social, the governance, the factors for environmental look at conservation and natural world, social looks at the treatment of people, diversity inside and outside the company, and some of the governance factors that company leadership undertake. How is your company run? What are some of the controls you have in place? And importantly, shareholder rights. Most important thing you need to understand is ESG is voluntary. and I don't think a lot of people realize that. But like I like to say, it's voluntary, but it's mandatory. And we'll explain why very, very shortly. So moving to the next slide. You got to ask yourself sometime how you got to where you are today. And sometimes the best way to figure that out is to understand where you were before. So we're going to go back essentially about 50 years, a little under 50 years here, a little over 50 years, excuse me, and to Milton Friedman. And Milton Friedman, an economist, indicated the social responsibility of businesses to increase its profits. And he argued that a company has no social responsibility, no responsibility to the public or society, only to shareholders. That worked back in 1970. Things changed. So if we can move on to the next slide. For some reason, I'm not able to move this along, but that's okay. So there's been an evolution. So we just talked about what things were in the 70s. Everybody was very comfortable with what Milton Friedman had to say. But as we went through the 80s, 90s, into 2000, we get to where we are today. We started with environmental health and safety issues. We talked about sustainability in the 90s, corporate social responsibility in the 2000s, and here we are now, taking a more holistic approach to the idea of environmental health and safety, sustainability, and corporate social responsibility, putting it under one umbrella and really looking at it from the standpoint of what does this mean in terms of risk and reward, and ultimately, how do you use this for competitive advantage? How do you position your company effectively and meet the requirements that investors are looking for under an ESG umbrella? Next slide. One of the things that I want to make sure everybody understands is there's a couple of ways you can look at this. We just showed the evolution, but one of the ways that you look at this in terms of how did we get to where we are, there are two books that I've read that I'm going to suggest you put on your reading list. Anthrovision by Gillian Tett. Gillian Tett's with the Financial Times, really provides an anthropological view and insight into ESG. For her, context matters. She makes the statement, history shows that when revolution takes place, it tends to succeed not when a tiny minority of committed activists embrace a cause, but when a silent majority decide it's too dangerous or pointless to resist change. That silent majority probably is the companies that along the line realize that this change is occurring. ESG, according to Tett, also brings in moral sentiments, which hopefully make markets and capitalism more durable and effective. The next book I'm going to suggest that you take a look at is, next slide, is Good Business. Bill Novelli, who is a distinguished professor at Georgetown University and one of the co-founders of Porter Novelli, the international public relations firm, has a similar take. He talks about Michael Porter and Mark Kramer's Harvard Business Review in 2010, which for some people may remember the discussion they had of the shared value concept. They talked about creating economic value by creating social value, and that yields a shared value, obviously for shareholders and stakeholders. Bill takes it and says, here, a company can improve its bottom line and shareholder value and do well by doing good. Makes perfect sense. It's part of the economic and social equation that companies are beginning to take a hard look at and understand that they need to engage with in order to be effective and meet not only shareholder but stockholder values. Next slide. So with all of that, there's a wave of change that's underway. And it's in process right now. We've got climate change, regulatory pressures, social and demographic shifts that are occurring. And we're going to talk about one of the demographic shifts that's occurred, and that is with millennials. They play a big role in this. Some of the privacy and data security concerns that are evolving, particularly over the use of social media and how companies and people communicate. And they all represent new and increasing risks. Companies face greater scrutiny if they're not adequately addressing the ESG risks, which comprehend these challenges. And COP26 and social unrest are good examples that amplify that focus and that urgency to do something. So along with the changes, the wave of change, next slide, we have a new generation of investors. So we look at those investors and we say to ourselves, who are they? They're the millennials. They're around the world and they're already driving a rapid growth in ESG focused sentiment. Bank of America says, hey, there's going to be about $20 trillion worth of asset growth in US domiciled ESG funds alone over the next 2 decades. So who are these millennials that are out there? They're 17 to 40 years old, roughly. And they're the ones who have spurred the growth in what we call sustainable or impact investing up to this point. And they are the people who are interested in solving the problems of the world. And so if they're going to be one of your investors, we need to consider their needs, what they're interested in. And one of their tools that they're leveraging and their capabilities that they're leveraging very effectively is the ubiquitous world of social media. And they have captured a worldwide audience with their concerns using the new social platforms that are out there that companies are beginning to utilize as well to get their messages out. Next slide, please. So with the wave of change and with the new investors who are out there, ESG brings a response. And I think you're probably all very familiar with what happened in 2019 when the Business Roundtable redefined the purpose of a corporation to promote what they called an economy that serves all Americans. Jamie Dimon, who's chairman of JP Morgan Chase and former chairman of the Business Roundtable, had 100+ members of BRT sign their new purpose of a corporation document. That point that he made at that point was that the American dream is still alive, but it was fraying, in his opinion, and I think in BRT's opinion. Major employers are investing in their workers and communities because they know it's the only way to be successful over the long term. So if I go beyond Jamie Dimon to our next slide, that brought action. And large institutional investors like BlackRock have become increasingly focused on corporations. Larry Fink indicated that corporations should have a goal to maximize positive societal impact in addition to shareholder value. I really want to thank him for releasing his annual letter just in time for this. It's perfect timing. I wanted to note that he goes a little bit further than the notations we've made here. He reaffirms his position on investing In today's globally interconnected world, a company must create value for and be valued by its full range of stakeholders in order to deliver long-term value for its shareholders. He indicates that stakeholder capitalism is not about politics. It's not a social or ideological agenda. He also says it's not woke. It is capitalism driven by mutually beneficial relationships between you and your employees and your customers and your suppliers and communities your company relies on to prosper. He understands as investors, he's clearly communicating and reinforcing the BlackRock position on the definition of value. Also on this slide, you see a comment he made: net zero demands transformation of the entire economy. He went a little further in his current letter, which you can read online in its full form if you choose. He's also indicating how important it is to work with all the companies that are being challenged right now in terms of where they are with their contribution long-term to this net zero world that we want to live in. And he recognizes very clearly the demands that are on it, traditional energy companies and others who have to continue to be able to bring us along, who have to be able to succeed and help through that transition that's going to give us the kind of economic growth and stability that we need, not only here in the US, but throughout the world. Next slide, please. So with all that, boardrooms are designing their strategies. 55% of CEOs believe that long-term sustainable success means looking beyond purely the financial growth aspects. My sense is that 55% is going to increase dramatically. The rise of stakeholder capitalism is being thrown into sharp focus by ESG. And in today's boardroom, business strategies are no longer designed for the benefit of shareholders alone. The stakeholders count. Next slide, please. With all that, investors are responding. We talked about the fact that we've got a lot of millennial investors out there. 88% of investors believe that prioritization of ESG initiatives represents better opportunities for long-term returns than the companies that do not. This is from an Edelman study that was done a couple of years ago. The crux of ESG involves investors identifying risks and opportunities that are not readily apparent in traditional corporate financial disclosures. This will segue into our discussion of ratings. That's how they get the information they need. And evolving ESG expectations reflect the notion that anything perceived by the market as materially affecting a company's long-term value should be measured, managed, and reported on, including the non-financial, social, and environmental information. One of the challenges going forward that every company is going to need to look at, and we'll talk about this in a little while about the ratings piece, is making sure that you understand what's in those ratings and that the type of information that's developed is in fact material, even if it's not the financial side of the business. That's a challenge that is out there that goes along with alignment, metrics, and balance that we'll talk about a little bit toward the end of the presentation. Next slide, please. So, how do we score? Who scores? Rating agencies do that. They compile scores which can vary from agency to agency. There are a lot of challenges here. Some focus only on environmental issues, others place value on social and government issues. Some do all three. The weight of various issues, which can fall under the ESG umbrella, is up for debate. There's a lot of confusion. There's a lot of concern out there. And the confusion comes from different rating agencies. We'll talk about how those agencies tend to look at things. And I'm going to show you a difference between two rating agencies. Many of these issues, many of the issues require increased coordination, and that's lacking. And many have called for standardized metrics across sectors and countries. But when you get outside the US and you are a international company, that can be extremely challenging to determine how best to establish your position in an ESG world. You can move to the next slide now. Thanks. So let's take a look at some agencies. There are many, many agencies, but according to a Squarewell study that was done recently, there are 4 major rating agencies that are used out there: Sustainalytics, MSCI, ISS ESG, and VE. Sustainalytics is a Morningstar company. Provides independent ESG and corporate governance research. MSCI provides ESG ratings. They're designed to measure a company's resilience to long-term industry relevant environmental, social, and government risks. ISS ESG is part of Institutional Shareholder Services. They empower investors and companies to build long-term sustainable growth, and they provide high-quality data and analytics. I'm not sure any of them don't provide high-quality data and analytics. And VE is part of Moody's, which everybody is probably familiar with, and serves as a growing global demand for ESG climate insights, including ESG scores. Spends a lot of time, obviously, on the climate side. When you look at all of these and you ask yourself, okay, who's giving me the information? Who's providing the scoring that I need out there? It turns out they probably all are. Next slide, please. What are they looking at? They're looking at the environmental, social, and governance factors. So I've broken them down into the big buckets in each of these. Environmental, GHG emissions, energy use. What kind of energy are you using? What's the mix? What's the water use? What's climate oversight look like for your company? What's your climate risk? In other words, how do you operate your business and what impact does it have? On the social side, we've got CEO pay, gender pay ratios, employee turnover, diversity, child labor, human rights. And I might also add, particularly if you're a global company, that you need to look at the UN Sustainable Development Goals, which include good health, well-being, and food and security. They are popping up, and as you'll see in a few moments, there's actually a framework out there under the UN that may be appropriate for some companies. Governance, I'm sure you understand, includes board composition, supplier conduct, ethics, anti-corruption, data privacy, and of course, ESG reporting. How are you doing it? And what they do is they look at the issues that are identified. The ratings are weighted and based on industry factors and timing, and the industry adjusted numerical scores are applied. They all have different approaches to the way they look at your information. So if we go to the next slide, I'm going to show you Sustainalytics, and how they rank for different companies. I've anonymized these, of course. First one, upper left, is a machinery company. Right below that is a pharmaceuticals company. And to the right, upper right, is an aerospace and defense company. And the one right below that is a consumer services company. Now you look at that and you say to yourself, okay, what I see are 4 numbers: high risk on the top 2, medium risk on the bottom. They give you a look at, where you can perform and how well these companies can perform. But what Sustainalytics is doing is it's looking at the exposure of the company to each of the factors, E, S, and G, and looking at how well they manage the risks within each of those and come up with a risk number. So high risk, medium risk, medium risk. Now, if you go to the next slide, and I'm going to ask you to go to the next slide, and you look at the MSCI rating, and I put just one in here because I wanted you to be able to see MSCI actually shows how they link their numerical scores to their ESG ratings. So what I did here is I picked another, and I really shouldn't say another, I picked a machinery company again. And you can see that this machinery company ranks an A, which is considered to be a company that is average among 30 companies in the construction and farm, machinery, and heavy trucks industry. So they got a score so that whoever is looking at this can understand what that score is, and then they can dig deeper into how that score came about. So this particular machinery company is ranked as average in terms of its performance. It's an A rating, which puts it at the top, at the bottom end of the leader category. Go back to the previous slide. Okay. The upper left-hand corner machinery company is high risk. That company is the same company that's rated average by MSCI. Now, if you're that company, you're going to need to dig into that. Go back to MSCI. If you're moving forward in looking at how your ESG performance is as a company, and you see this differential, you can pick this score up almost automatically online, but you have to buy the full reports. And one of the things that we would be suggesting is that every company look at every single every ESG score that's out there where they might be being picked up. Because these companies are making a lot of money putting together these reports for all good reasons. And it's extremely important that you as a company understand where you rank within these various score categories and with these various rating companies. Now, if you go to the next slide, I used, again, Sustainalytics to say, okay, so the scores are out there. I know my score as a company. I'm checking around to find out what's going on. I'm working with these companies and should be working with these companies to figure out how they're analyzing me. But what are they doing with them? First of all, obviously the corporates piece of this, and they're all about the same in this regard, help the individual companies to understand, how they connect with the company about the ESG risk and the rating license that they've got. But beyond that, there are two groups that also get this information: banks and lenders and investors. Banks are looking at this information, and others are looking at the banks to determine a couple of things. The banks want to know, what does it look like when I lend to a company? What kind of an ESG rating do they have? The other side of it is the banks are being looked at by their shareholders, and they're being looked at as well now by the Fed, because the Fed wants to know, who are they lending to? The shareholders want to know, who are they lending to? Are they lending to ESG, let's call them proficient and acceptable companies? What kind of ratings do they have? Are there challenges? And some of the things that are going on, particularly in the banking industry, I'm sure Lowell will talk about it a little bit later on, can be very challenging, particularly when you have the Fed start to indicate that they have an extreme interest in where money is being lent, because they want to be part of the solution process to figuring out how we improve environmental, social, and governance ratings among the companies. Last but not least, and surely understood by everybody, is it's investors who are really looking at these numbers, which for publicly held companies is extremely important to make sure that they understand who their investors are, and what kind of performance ratings that they're seeing. Now, if you go to the next slide, I jump right into this, and I don't want to spend a lot of time on this slide except to say that ESG is global. One of the interesting points is that in this particular slide, we talk about what's known as the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosure. And when you look at that, what you're beginning to realize is that while only 5% of all companies work around this particular framework, this is really becoming compulsory throughout the entire globe. It is the essentially the baseline to determine how performance is being measured and what kind of information is being required under the framework to determine the environmental performance of companies. While it is not mandatory, as I said, it's compulsory, the EU is also implementing what is known as the Sustainability Finance Disclosure Regulation Vehicle, and that has an even broader reach, and that is going to directly impact companies operating within the EU. Similar to a regulation that might, at some point come out of, let's say, the SEC. If you go to the next slide, I'm going to take you through 3 global standards organizations here. These are framework organizations. The most significantly used one is the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board, SASB. Anybody who's a publicly held company knows who they are. They were established in 2018. They published a set of standards, and it's specific to 77 industries. They deal with financially material topics. It's designed for companies and investors needing to analyze how ESG might impact performance, and it complements a lot of other ESG initiatives. If you go to the next slide, the other 2 that are used, GRI is also heavily used. It's created in 1997. It was first used to give companies metrics to show how they're performing from an environmental standpoint and on a global and holistic basis. I'm mentioning the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals piece again because they're picking up more and more interest, particularly among international companies. Now, what are these global standards organizations? As a company, you need to decide how you're going to report your information to the rating agencies. The best thing to do is to find a global standards framework organization that allows you to frame the information in a way that it's consistent to each of the rating agencies. And with that as a basis, it may be that you report on a couple of different framework levels, depending on the type of business that you have. If you're heavily engaged, particularly energy companies, if you're involved in finance, it might be that you're using more than one framework to get your information out. The fact is that by picking the right framework, you're able to effectively communicate your information to the various rating agencies. Because with or without your framework, the rating agencies are going to dig through financials, they're going to dig through publicly available information, and they're going to get their hands on everything they possibly can to do the job that they do, and that is to rate your company on an ESG basis. If you go to the next slide, we talk about regulation. And in the past, in the US, and that is within the last couple of years, the SEC under former Chairman Jay Clayton, he had considered that the existing securities laws and financial materiality standards were sufficient to meet the requirements that investors needed. Now, driven by developing ESG trends and investor demand, the new chair, Gary Gensler, has created a climate and ESG task force and sent out a request for public comment on climate change and disclosures, which was received last year. We're waiting for the guidelines. It's very clear that if you look at what's occurring right now, the SEC is ready to jump into this thing absolutely, big time. And the fact of the matter is that the SEC found that 60 of 94 ESG funds failed to adhere closely to the principles of environmental, social, and governance investing. The findings, which had been shared with the SEC, indicate that one can't tell the difference between a prospectus for a true ESG offering versus greenwashing mutual funds and ETFs. So, according to Commissioner Crenshaw, who's working on this, there is significant investor demand for comparable, dependable, and decision-useful climate disclosures. Again, we expect those guidelines to come out imminently. I will only footnote here, there was some activity in the House last year. There were about 4 or 5 bills that were put together. Those bills sit out there. They're not going to go anywhere from a legislative standpoint. The next big step is, what does SEC do? What kind of guidance do they provide? My expectation is, as we're getting into proxy seasons and everything, those guidelines should be out soon. And I just checked before we got on, nothing new as of about 4:30 this afternoon. So stay tuned. Next slide, please. So what are the challenges and opportunities? We've got a lot of challenges. Well-meaning investors possibly being misled by conflicting ratings, much as we were just indicating that the SEC is concerned with. How best do you standardize rules governing claims made by banks, asset management firms, and other financial entities regarding what they categorize as green within their portfolios? There are significant difficulties comparing metrics across business sectors and in different countries. As we've mentioned, you can find the same company getting different ratings from 2 different companies. That has to be sorted out. And a big challenge is ensuring that principles and frameworks do not restrict capital cost, allocation of capital, that can result in supply constraints, adding operating costs, and contributing to inflation. We'll talk about that particular issue once we get to the next slide. But there are opportunities. ESG development can be and probably will be a catalyst for constructive conversations and the collaboration, spurring balance and alignment of quantitative and qualitative metrics globally. We wrote about this a couple of months ago at the ACCF, indicating that without balance, without alignment, without consistent metrics, we will not be able to get the kind of results from ESG and achieve the results ESG seeks to gain. The application of flexible, aligned, and principles-based reporting systems are going to be mandatory. The ability to improve and promote business perception, your market position, and your financial performance really depend on getting these things right. And last but not least, getting it right will help attract and retain talent in your company. And we're going to need more talent in the companies to take care of this particular issue. This is as important as your financial reporting. Next slide. So what are we going to watch? A couple of things pop up right now. Energy and aerospace defense investment. It's currently under scrutiny. It's impacting access to and allocation and cost of capital. Why? The investors are shunning some of the companies that are involved in these sectors. It's one of the reasons why I think Larry Fink mentioned in his letter this year that we need to understand that companies that are doing better, doing well, are in fact on their way to helping achieve the goals. And there are certain things that have to be done in order to effectively run the world, meet lifestyle requirements. As somebody once said, you're not going to have sustainability unless you have security. Financial institutions, they're being challenged by shareholders, and we've talked about this, the Federal Reserve to balance financing investment needs with ESG. There's concerns of proxy firms may be seen as forcing board changes that might compromise sound operating practices. This is a balance issue, and this is making sure that people understand what they're voting on and the importance of what they're voting on in terms of where their companies are going and what they're doing. On the other side of that argument is the fact that if you're involved in the ESG production of information, make sure that it does in fact accurately reflect what your company is doing on a long-term basis so that investors understand how to vote and what are the appropriate ways to vote to get the returns that they need for their companies within the context of accurate ESG reporting. Last but not least, stranded assets that be driven by unanticipated or premature write-downs, devaluation, or conversion liabilities. This is something that's going to have to be watched very, very closely over time. And it's going to be a financial and operational management issue working through the ESG guidelines for companies in order to effectively work through this issue. Last but not least, on the next slide, the final slide before we go to Q&A, action plans. Effective implementation, execution of ESG processes is absolutely multidisciplinary. Board leadership is imperative. You've got to identify organizational ESG leadership in your company. People have to be responsible for ESG and everything associated with ESG, just like you would if you were managing the financial side of your business. We're finding that if you work with audit firms, you can really accelerate your ability to address scoring and reporting. They understand what's going on. More and more audit firms are really adding more and more staff in order to build up their capabilities to assist their clients with ESG reporting and monitoring. Work with your industry associations to communicate and coordinate needs. As the SEC regulations come out, as global regulations come out, as you work toward alignment, balance, and developing sound metrics, your associations that understand your business have to be able to advocate and communicate what's going to be needed, not only domestically, but globally. Of course, investor relations engagement's imperative, but also develop public community relations, advocacy, and education strategies. And understand your suppliers and your supply chains. As I said at the beginning, this particular ESG issue goes well beyond publicly held companies, privately held companies, many of those in the supply chain. Publicly held companies are going to be working very closely with their supply chain members, and supply chain members are going to be communicating with the companies that they do in fact supply. I can give you one of the best examples that I've seen out there lately, comes from an industry I know something about, and that is the retail side of the petroleum industry has developed a set of ESG standards so that they can report back as to how they're performing and what their performance levels look like, understanding that in the long term, they're going to be selling different liquid fuels and they're going to be adding electric charging stations. They're going to be doing things that improve their carbon footprint while they carry the signs of companies that are still trying to supply the much needed, absolutely needed current energy and fuels that everybody needs. And so these retailers have now figured out a way how to communicate that information back to their suppliers in a way that will benefit them and their suppliers together. So with that, I want to say thanks for this opportunity to address this issue. I hope it's been helpful. We could literally create a course on this. I joked with some people that this is a course, and quite frankly, if you look at MBA courses, there is a whole group called the UN Principles for Responsible Management Education that's beginning to look at just this issue and how important it is that schools begin to develop the types of people that are going to be needed in your organizations in order for you to be able to effectively run your ESG portfolios. So with that, I say thanks, and I'm going to turn it over to Lowell or whoever to start generating the Q's and A's.
Let's definitely take some questions. I'll start it off just to get it rolling. But I saw something a while back that was a Harris poll data that showed that 50% of a buying decision for a consumer is based on the actions or inactions of the CEO of that company or other ESG related types of things. So that clearly makes this an economic imperative as much as any type of mandates or regulatory. But do you see a day where how far will these scores go down? Meaning publicly traded companies, I understand that, but did you see it becoming a competitive factor, meaning that if you're bidding on some work with a publicly traded company and the publicly traded company say you're either helping my score or you're hurting my score, do you see that as a criteria for awarding contracts going forward? And do you see the government looking at it the same way and awarding government contracts?
Lowell, I absolutely do. It is one of the things that's occurring out there right now is that particularly government contractors are being asked to provide information regarding their scores in some cases so that they can effectively show that they're meeting some of these new requirements. I think it's going to become ubiquitous over time. And companies, I think, understand that they are also going to be looking at suppliers the same way and asking the same questions. What are you doing to show that if I bring you in to do work for me, that I'm improving my ESG performance and scores?
Very good, thank you. So yeah, please, any questions, just jump in and just ask them live. If that's, I know Gigi's, I can tell she's got a question on her mind, but please, anyone, please jump in.
One of the concerns and one of the issues keeping many of our board members up at night is the ability to attract top talent. And I'm wondering, and really this is as much a question for you, Mike, as it is for other board members, if our board members are seeing evidence that prospective top talent hires are looking at their ESG scores or their perception of what their ESG profile is.
Again, absolutely happening. Go back to what we talked about for the millennials who are out there, 17 to 40 years old, looking for a job. I'm as altruistic as can be, and I want to go to work for a company that I know is going to meet not only my financial requirement, but where I can make a contribution and know that that contribution is resulting in improvements in the environment. And that the company has, the social and the governance practices in place that are going to make me feel comfortable as an employee. Competition is already great, as everybody who's probably on this call knows right now, for good talent. And that's why I mentioned at the end of the presentation that getting the talent that you've got and retaining it is going to be extremely important, because you're going to need these people to be working in your general operations, but you're going to need people who understand ESG and who can add value in that particular area. And for international companies, this is a big, big deal, because you've got to be able to look out throughout the entire world, figure out what's going on, and work towards balance and alignment, which are going to be the ways that we're really going to make sure ESG gets us collectively where we need to go.
Okay, other questions, please? I do see it. Did see one that popped up. Yeah, we will make the slide deck available.
Yes.
So everybody will have access to the slide deck itself. But
Great. Other questions?
I do have one quick
Besides-
one. Just
Go
myself,
ahead.
I'm sorry, Mike, but is there evidence now that a highly rated ESG score also there's a correlation to better performance, or is it
Yes,
just not enough data yet? Yeah.
There is, I think at this stage, some questions about performance. There definitely is an advantage to attracting investors with a great ESG score. I think there's transition going on. It depends on industries. I think some are definitely benefiting. I can't imagine that any company that doesn't perform well from an ESG standpoint is not going to perform well financially. If you go back to that early slide that we had about where we've come over the years, and particularly since about the 80s, we started out with some of the environmental health and safety issues. And, we used to always say that safe companies are high performing companies. That isn't changing. And what we're now adding is collectively all the other components that say, look, if I have a well-run company, it's a smart company, people understand the goals, and all of the collective goals are brought together under that ESG umbrella, I'm probably going to be a much better performing company. And the employees who have to contribute to the work that that company is doing are going to be the ones who want to add value and will add the value that's important for those companies to get to the goals that they have, which are financial and then their ESG component.
Okay.
Does anybody have any, not questions,
Joan,
but
I
are
think
there
Joan
any
has her hand up, Lowell.
Oh,
Joan McLaughlin.
okay.
Sorry, I can't see that. So please,
sorry.
yes.
Hi, Mike. I'm Joan McLaughlin from Sodexo.
How are you?
I'm well, and I appreciate your presentation.
Thank you.
We have been very active in the corporate social responsibility space for quite a while, and we have made some pledges, and we also remember the Dow Jones Sustainability Index, and but one of the things that we have been talking about, and I actually was on a call just this morning, is about how we are seeing, particularly in this last year, more and more of a focus on CEO activism and CEOs coming out and taking positions on highly charged matters,
Right.
and matters that that this country is divided upon, frankly. And I'm curious to know if you have experience or information or thoughts on how companies decide what they're going to lean in on and what they're going to kind of stay back on, or take a position of silence, or or not be very active around.
Interesting question. First of all, let me take it from this standpoint. I think there's a lot more transparency among companies now as a result of ESG. I think companies are forward-leaning because their boards are telling them and their investors are telling them, tell me what's going on. Tell me what you're doing. ESG helps to make that happen because you have to report it. And if you're out digging into your ESG numbers and you find out that you've got a hole somewhere, something that needs to be solved, you're going to want to pick that up. So I think it's the transparency piece that ESG helps bring, so that you get companies right now setting objectives. Instead of just setting objectives, how are you going to get from point A to point B over time? Show me what you've done. Show me what you're doing right now, and be vocal about it, be front and center about it, whether it's on the environmental side, the social side, or the governance side. I just don't see any way now. And, going back to what I mentioned earlier about who the investors are, and it's not just the millennials, but the millennials play a big piece of this thing right now, just demographically. Because of social media, if I were to go out and look at corporations throughout the world right now, I would find that their media exposure, their social media exposure has been amplified. And the reason why is you want to be talking to people. You want to be giving them the good news. What am I doing step by step? So the veil has been taken down, I think, and I hope that answers your question.
Yes.
And I expect to see much more communication. And as a result of that, probably more collaboration in terms of how people go about explaining what they're doing to improve the ESG pieces of their portfolios.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Well, I know we're coming up on the hour. I don't know if there's any last question. We're not.
There's one more question in the chat
Okay, great.
box. It says,
Great.
Calvin from CSR ESG, where are we heading in the future after ESG?
Do I understand the question? Where are we heading after ESG?
Where are we heading? Where are we heading in the future after ESG? Yes.
You know what? I don't know. All I know is I think ESG is a pretty full plate right now. And I will say this, there will be something after ESG, I can guarantee it, because there always is. I think what's after ESG is going to be a function of how well ESG works. There are some naysayers out there, and I think anybody who's written about ESG or read about it, it understands there are people who say, it'll be gone in 5 years. I am not one of those people. I believe it's here to stay, it's important, it's serving a purpose. We've got to get, it's heavily driven obviously by the E component, but the S and G components are just as important. And as people become more comfortable with reporting those, and most importantly, we get the alignment and the flexibility built into these ratings so that companies are comfortable with what is coming out and what they're able to say about their performance, I think will make great gains. And it will help us from an environmental, social, and governance standpoint. And as people get more comfortable, the next step, I'm not sure what it'll be, but it will build off of ESG, I can guarantee you.
May I ask a question?
You may.
So I'm trying to basically understand from domestic investment versus overseas investment and the way that the stage of the company is evolving. Is it appropriate to say that this currently is only targeting corporations and not for investment companies that are looking to grow? So is there an opportunity for smaller companies that are technology-based that need investment to look at ESG versus traditional social responsibility? Or is it something they need to perhaps look outside, such as Switzerland or other areas that may be farther along? Is that something that is appropriate, or are we just at a beginning stage where smaller companies are not really being targeted at this point?
Let me answer it this way. Whoop, getting some feedback there. Something changed. Somebody turned something off. Okay. Here's what I think is happening. Any company that is a startup, anybody who's looking to be bootstrapped, anybody who's looking for private investment is going to have to report under one of these frameworks, because somebody out there, an investor, ultimately is going to want to know what is this company's plan to deal in that environment. And if the company is small and is providing services, they're going to be asked by those they're providing services to or supplying materials to, whatever the case may be, they're going to be asked what they're doing, because there's the knock-on effect to the next company in the supply chain. But absolutely, this is not just about big corporations. As I said at the outset, it's independent companies have got to look at this. That's why I mentioned what's going on in the retail fuels industry right now. Those are all essentially private companies, with the exception of a few who buy from major petroleum providers and suppliers who are publicly held. They want to be able to tell the companies they work with how they're performing, and that's no different for a startup. So absolutely. And which is why I think some of the education that's going to be going on and that's being pushed again by this UN group and by others all recognize, and to the point of the question earlier, this is not going away. This is going to be here for a while, and it'll be the next step to something else.
And the last thing I would say to that, Mike, just being in the banking industry, I see this coming. More than coming, because the way the Federal Reserve or the OCC look at how they allocate, how much capital you have to allocate to certain industries, right? And which is going to mean if you're going to lend in what I even heard called them brown industries. Like, I don't know if you've heard that before, Mike, but I thought that was a little, that your capital allocation is going to be significantly greater, which means the access to that capital or the cost of that capital is going to be different. Now, right, if someone can come and here's my ESG score and here's that will help in shaking out how that goes, but that's a very practical implication of what's coming with ESG.
Right. Exactly. Are there any concerns out there at this point? Is there anything we missed or anything that you want us to take a look at? Then I guess we covered it all.
I think we're good.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you.
Yeah.
I really appreciate it. We started this conversation about how was all of this affecting banking and investing, and then it was, well, actually it's affecting the energy industry, and I suspect at some point it's going to be an issue for the utilities, which are not huge, and we have utilities on this call too, on our board of directors. And then so it then becomes, and how are law firms doing if they're, if they do environmental law work and they take a certain position? They might be experts, but are they perceived as on one side or the other of the issue? So it's talented. The more reading and the more we're looking at this, the more we realize that this has long tentacles.
It does. It does. It is here.
So it's, I think it's here, and it's important already. So I want to, just say thank you, Mike, for working with us, because there was a lot of preparation that went into trying to get a very, very big topic into, basically an hour of conversation. So I want to say thank you, and yield back to our chair, Lowell.
Yes, I just reiterate that. Thank you very much. Timely topic with it. We're going to learn more and more about, and I think it's going to affect us in our daily lives pretty much from here on. But thank you for your time, Mike. Greatly appreciate it. Thank you.
Appreciate the opportunity.
We hope that you'll stay engaged. May we share your presentation with our attendees?
You may. I think you've got a PDF format of it, if I'm not mistaken.
Right.
So feel free to do that. Yes.
Thank you
Yes.
very much.
And if they need to contact me, the email address for ACCF is there, and look forward to answering any questions anybody might have.
Thank you.
Thank
Thanks
you.
so much.
Bye-bye.
Thank
everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
And thank you
Thanks,
to
everybody.
our board members and our guests that joined us for this great conversation. And we will see you next time. Thank you.
Sounds good. Thanks, everybody.
Bye-bye, everybody.
Thank you.